about quite a few different aspects of protecting crops and produce and rising temperatures, both a little bit about what you can do in the field, but a lot more about what you can do after the field, because typically the errors happen in the transition from field to storage. So I'm going to talk about 5 things overall today. I'll go over some basic plant physiology to kind of get us acclimated to what we're kind of talking about within the fruit and vegetables. Then I'll mention a little bit about what the heat response in plants is, a little bit about heat units, and then talk about some mitigation strategies for produce heat stress, and then some cooling methods for small scale growers that are used in Iowa and across the world, really. So we'll start with some basic plant physiology. So the question I always pose to my students and to people who are interested are, does all the food produced get to the consumer? And the answer is no. And the question then is, well, how much is lost between harvest and consumption? And it depends on the crop. So it depends on both the commodity as well as the technology at hand to potentially preserve that crop. So you can see here a big coal pile of apples that were unable to sell for various reasons here at a farm. So how large are these losses? Overall, for all types of horticulture crops, depending on the crop, it's typically between 5 and 25% overall loss. And if you're in an area or you don't have adequate refrigeration on your site, it could be anywhere from 25 to 50%. And then it's currently estimated that worldwide, 25 to 35% of all fruits and vegetables are never consumed. And then another 8 to 15% are never sold after harvest once they reach like a grocery store. So there's quite a substantial amount of food loss in our food system if you break it down into looking at it this way. And mainly the real nitty gritty of the reason is a lot of it's actually heat related. But the other thing to think about is fruit and vegetables are alive. Most people don't think that the apple they're eating is alive, right? But it's technically alive, it's still respirating. And since all of our fruit and vegetables, if we're eating them fresh, are still alive, that means they're still undergoing compositional changes. They're respiring, so their cells are still, they're not breathing like we respirate, but they're still, taking in oxygen and converting it to carbon dioxide. They're losing water, especially once they're detached from their mother plant. They're susceptible to physiological breakdown, aka aging. So they're no longer attached to that mother plant. They only have so much starch, so much sugar in them. They can't make more. So they're going to be using that to respirate, and that's going to cause physiological breakdown as they deplete those storage in their cells. They're susceptible to bruising and damage, so they're responding to stimuli. So if you pick an apple too hard, you can end up with a nice bruise on it. That's because it's still alive. You damage the cells underneath your thumb. They can also get diseases. So we're not going to talk about post-harvest diseases too much in this talk, but that's also a big cause of a loss, because as fruits and vegetables are removed from their mother plant, they become more susceptible to a lot of different fungi and bacteria that also want to eat them. So some fruits and vegetables will continue to ripen after being harvested, and these experience a significant increase in respiration and ethylene production as it ripens, and they're referred to as climacteric. So ethylene is a hormone that plants make when they're stressed out. It's a gas, so some fruit and vegetable crops are sensitive to ethylene and will have a significant increase in their respiration as ethylene increases, and some don't. So the ones that do are referred to as climacteric. So you can kind of think about it from a standpoint of what's going to continue ripening after you harvest it. So the most well-known climacteric fruits, I think, are apples, bananas, and avocados. You've probably heard oh, you have unripe avocados, you should put an apple inside a bag with your avocados, they'll ripen right up. Same with bananas. Apples are severe ethylene producers, and they will produce ethylene, trap it in a bag with bananas or avocados. The bananas and avocados will react to that ethylene and start ripening faster. Whereas once you pick a strawberry or a grape, it's done maturing. It won't mature any further than when it was picked. So what this looks like, if we graph it out, so we have on our y-axis the relative rate of either ethylene and respiration, and then we have time after harvest. And for climacteric fruits, what you'll see is as they continue to mature after harvest, they'll start to produce a lot more ethylene. And as they start producing ethylene, the respiration will rise and it'll eventually crash. One thing that's really cool though is post-harvest, and we can do this with temperature modification as well as air modification, is we can stop it from ripening. So like you think about bananas, they harvest them green and then they ripen on their way up here. They can either make that process go faster or slower depending on how much ethylene they allow in that system, as an example. So a non-climacteric fruit, as the crop is harvested, they won't produce any more ethylene than they're already producing, but their respiration will start to go down over time. And you can kind of think of that as they're dying, basically. So this is the two different types of fruits. This is also true for other vegetables as well. When I say fruits, I'm talking botanically. So like a tomato or a squash is technically a fruit. So there's a lot of fruits and vegetables that fit into these categories. And the big gist is non-climacteric fruits and veggies need to be harvested when they are fully ripe. So now that we know a little bit more about how the plants are reacting to being harvested, they're pretty stressed out when they get harvested. They've been detached from their mother plant, they're fully ripe, and we want to store them so we can sell them, right? So now we got to talk about the heat response in plants. Okay. So pretty much the most important thing you can do to ensure a long life and high quality product is to exercise temperature control. Whether that's, usually that starts in the field. So I'll mention kaolin clay again later, but here's an example. We have some grapes. This specific cultivar can get sunburn and sun scald pretty easily as they ripen. So you can see we're actually applying this white stuff to them, and we're going to continue to apply white stuff to it. The white stuff is called Surround, WP, and it's a wettable powder. It's actually the inactive ingredient in toothpaste, kaolin clay. So we're going to be spraying our grapes, in this case, with the kaolin clay to help keep that sun directly off our grapes, in this case. There's a lot of crops that it can be used for, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later. But the best thing you can do for fruit or vegetables is to cool it to its lowest safe temperature as soon as possible, keeping the sun off of it in the field, and then getting the heat out of it as soon as you can. So whenever you cool the crop, it reduces that rate of respiration to its lowest level as quickly as possible. It also reduces that rate of water loss, so you get a higher quality product that lasts longer. Post-harvest life and quality are inversely related to the rate of respiration of the fruit or vegetable. And I have a slide that's really old but still good that talks about that. So to do that correctly, you have to know what the lowest safe temperature for that fruit or vegetable is and get to it as fast as possible. So this is a very old slide. This is literally a picture of a slide from a slide, but it's still good. So on this axis, we have the relative rate of perishability from very low, low, moderate, high to very high, and the relative rate of respiration from low to very high. So we can see, probably no one's surprised, asparagus, thinking about it's basically a stem. We just cut it off from its rooting system. Sweet corn and peas have a very high rate of respiration and a very high rate of perishability. Strawberries, artichoke, broccoli. Bananas are kind of in the middle with tomatoes and peaches. And down at the end, you can see apples are kind of low, low, as long as potatoes, whereas nuts and dates, if you think about the water content too, whenever you're looking at this, it also kind of makes sense. So um, if it has a high perishability, it probably has a high rate of respiration. So getting the heat out of the veggie crop or fruit crop as soon as possible will let them stay longer. So that's what the plant's doing in response to heat. We want to keep its respiration low so it's not stressed out. And when there's high heat, there's higher respiration. Kind of think of any living thing. So let's understand these heat units a little bit better. So I keep on saying this, but during and after harvest, crops should be cooled to their optimum storage temperature range as quickly as possible for optimum quality. Failing to do so increases that rate of respiration and thus the rate of deterioration. And this is also worse when the temperatures outside are already hot or a plant has been exposed to really hot, then really cold, then really hot. Once it's been exposed to like a lot of heat, the cellular level, the plant's still kind of responding to that. So if you have a heat wave and still wait a couple days, the plant's already probably at a higher rate of respiration than it would have been if there was no heat wave. So the next question I usually get is, well, how do I figure this out? How do I find respiration and cooling information for my specific crops? And I got you there too. So this is the USDA Agricultural Handbook number 66. Starting from the early 1900s, the USDA has been putting together all of these different agricultural handbooks. And 66 is the commercial storage handbook. It has, I think, 138 crops listed in it, all of which grow in the United States. And it'll tell you everything you need to know about how to store these crops. So for example, it has a detailed summary for pretty much all fruits and vegetables that we can grow in the United States, flowers and nursery stock as well. It outlines what those optimal temperatures, humidity, and atmospheric conditions are best for storage, but it also talks about quality attributes and maturity indicators, grading and packaging recommendations, pre-cooling techniques and retail display guidance, respiration, as well as ethylene sensitivity in production and chilling sensitivity. It also lists the most common physiological disorders and post-harvest pathogens for most of the crops if we know what they are. Um, it also talks about different quarantine considerations and suitability for fresh cut products, as well as some safety, nutritional quality, and texture evaluation if that's been done on those crops. Some crops have way more information than others. Like for instance, some of them also have food safety practices, as well as some nutritional and sensory quality, as well as more fresh cut produce considerations. So for instance, the chapter on apples is pretty long, whereas the chapter on prickly pear fruit is a little bit shorter. So it pretty much has the basics for everything, but some of them, they have way more beyond the basics. So it's a really, really neat book. It's free online from that link. You can either, I'll post it again, or you can just type in USDA Handbook 66, it pops right up. So as an example, for raspberries, it tells you the temperature. So we need to store it at 31 to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, basically 0 Celsius, like really like at freezing, as close as possible, with a high level of humidity. And if you do that, you'll be able to get 5 to 7 days of shelf life of those raspberries. And it also has notes. So raspberries cannot tolerate water. So if you're chilling them, you have to use an air-only method. And we'll talk about what those are towards the end of this talk as an example. So, but there's a lot more information about raspberries than just this. This is just kind of the nitty-gritty. So produce heat stress and mitigation strategies. So there's a lot of different things you can do. The worst thing though is whenever you get heat stress in the field, it's pretty hard to control. So here we got some heat stressed strawberries that ended up aborting. because it just got too hot for them. So they ended up coming off, having some blackening down here. It looks like a pathogen, but this is actually heat stress in strawberries. And this is also heat stress in raspberries. Apologies, the picture's a little blurry, but if raspberry flowers get too hot, they'll also die and turn black, and then the fruit kind of gets this weird translucenty brown color. It kind of looks like a disease called botrytis, but once you see enough of it, you can kind of tell which one's heat related, which one's not. So for instance, this year we've had a really hot couple of weeks, and especially for some of our yellow raspberries across the state, they've had a lot of heat damage to them. There's not too much you can do. Once you see it, you can't really do anything. But for the future, you can try to do pop-up tents or tarps to protect produce as much as possible, just to keep the sun off them. You can mist them if available, get some water on them. You know, plants can't sweat. That's not true. Not all plants sweat. Some plants sweat, some plants don't. And for the most part, our specialty crops don't. And then I mentioned surround WP. It's useful depending on the crop. It's really good for a crop that has a wash step. So unfortunately, in the case of strawberries and raspberries, which I have here, you're a little bit more limited on what you can do. Using some kind of low tunnel or some kind of like hooping to get the heat off of them is probably going to be a little bit better. But surround is really good for crops that can be washed, like apples, grapes, squash, anything like that, especially if you've had heat-related problems in the past. So this is a picture from University of Maine, but this is an example of tripping at the finish line. So these are some honey crisps that were harvested and stored, and when the grower took them out of storage, they looked like this. And the thing that I'm saying like looked like this is you can see this discoloration on the top. And I show this picture because it sparked a large debate within the apple researcher community of what happened to these apples. So you can think about what potentially happened to these apples, but I'm going to tell you what happened to them. The grower of these Honeycrisp apples were picking apples, and they something happened, and they ended up leaving their fruit in the baskets out in the field for a very long time. And we realized after talking more to the grower and other researchers that it was only the fruit that was in the sun. Pretty much all of these little spots are from where the fruit was exposed to the sun after it had been harvested. So the fruit was harvested in baskets, but it just didn't make it from the orchard to the cooler in time, and they all got sunburned. They did not look like this when the grower put them in the cooler, though. So these injuries developed while they were being stored. So he spent all that time, energy, effort, and money storing apples that he wouldn't be able to sell. So this is a great example of tripping at the finish line and what can happen whenever you harvest when it's hot or have a problem like that. And of course, you know, things happen. It's hot. You still have to harvest things. Just choosing the right time of day or just doing things in smaller batches to make sure you're not losing your produce after doing all that work of picking them in the heat is also really important. So things that we can do, harvest during cooler times, potentially early morning or before dawn. That's also great for worker protection and worker safety as well. Pretty much move produce out of the direct sunlight immediately. So for instance, that apple grower, he could have had a structure like a tent that he put the apples under instead of leaving them in the field under the trees, and transporting them as quickly as possible to a cool storage space, or pretty much cooling them to remove that field heat as soon as possible to get that rate of respiration down. There's some ways that you can do this faster than others. Anything that has that high respiration rate, so thinking back to our table or our chart that we saw, making sure that they're refrigerated as soon as possible. So a lot of folks, especially smaller scale, you can just get a window AC unit It's a really expensive retrofit option. Put it in an insulated shed, garage, or cargo container just to hold the produce at a cooler temperature and get it as cool as possible, as fast as possible. So if you don't have a fancy water heat remover or a fancy dunk tank, or you're growing something like asparagus that you can't do that for, just getting it into a cooler unit as fast as possible um, really makes a huge difference. Like even an hour can make a huge difference for some of these crops, especially whenever it's been hot and the crop has already been exposed to heat, like a summer like this one. The other thing to do would be to reduce moisture loss. If you have stacked boxes, cover them with plastic liners. Get things in containers as fast as possible. There's We could do a whole webinar just on different types of containers. I was originally going to talk about it, and then I realized it would get in the weeds really fast, but there's lots of options for containers to help both get field heat out as well as reducing moisture loss. So thinking about cooling methods for small scale growers, there's several ways to cool fruits and vegetables. If the commodity is being consumed or processed within 1 or 2 hours, cooling might not be needed. So if you're going to make jams, jellies, canning, frozen food, you might not have to worry about this step so much. This is more for if you're going to have like a farmer's market the next day, or you're selling to a grocery store, or somewhere where the fruit or vegetables might not be consumed right away or processed right away. So take that with what I'm saying. So if you're going to just blanch all your peaches in a couple of hours and make peach jam out of it, then maybe cooling's not necessary. One thing that usually, it's an extra expense, but it's totally worth it. You should not use a storage unit as the cooling unit. So a storage unit and a cooling unit should be two different things. It's about 100 times as much energy to cool the product as it is to keep it cool. So even though it feels like, oh, why do I have to buy a storage container or retrofit the shed with a cooling unit in it whenever I have a storage unit, it's actually way more economically better to have a separate cooling unit than a storage unit. Pretty much once a product is cooled, it's a lot easier to keep it cool. So if you think about when you go to the grocery store, you buy something cool, put it in your car, take it home, put it in your fridge. It doesn't really have, unless like you're traveling really long distances and then you're probably going to buy a cooler, transport it in a special bag, right? You're doing that because the product, in this case the vegetable or fruit, doesn't really react well to being hot then cold, hot then cold. It's way better, lasts longer to keep it cool. And then the other thing to think about too is some fruits and vegetables cannot tolerate water or ice and must be cooled by cold air only. So thinking about our berries or anything like that with that really soft skin. And like I said, the USDA 66 handbook will list if it can't be cooled by water or ice, if you're not 100% sure. So there's quite a few ways to cool fruit or vegetables, but at a small scale, the four most common ways are room cooling, forced air cooling, hydro cooling, and icing. And there's several forms of icing. And this is a picture that Dr. Richard Gladden drew, who taught post-harvest before me. Again, a picture of a slide, but this has been a question for a very long time and can really, really get in the weeds. So what's the cooling methods best for me? So is it transit cooling, package icing, liquid icing, vacuum cooling, hydro cooling, room cooling, forced air cooling, hydrovac cooling? A lot of these are really expensive and not worth it if, especially if you're small scale or not like, a major producer. A lot of times you can get away with just doing forced air cooling or room cooling or some kind of icing or package icing. And then wherever you're taking it to, that next step, like for instance, a grocery store, co-op, it's going to be up to like a larger entity to keep that stuff cool. But if you're doing like large scale production, then a hydrovac cooling or something like vacuum cooling might be worth the expense of doing that. So room cooling would be the example I mentioned of having an AC unit in like a smaller space. The product is placed in a refrigerated room where the air gradually cools the product. The advantage is it's simple, low cost, works for many crops. However, it's slow. So it doesn't sound like it should be slow, but it's pretty slow. So you can look at this graph here. So if you have something coming straight out of the field, it's pretty much like half-life-esque on a scale of how long it'll actually take to get it to down to 4 degrees or 0 degrees of cooling in this kind of, with this style. So you're letting the air take the heat out, and it's just slow. So this may or may not work for different crops. Like if you're thinking about asparagus, for instance, this might not be the most economic way. It's probably too slow. However, maybe for apples or grapes or something that's a little bit medium, moderate to low respiration already, this is probably a good way to go. Forced air cooling. So this is a pretty old-fashioned thing to do. You can see these apples are in the crates, and there's a fan attached to the apple crates, and it's literally pulling air through the crates and out. So you can do this to pull cold air through stacks of boxes or bins of produce. Advantage, it's much faster than room cooling. It's also more uniform cooling. The disadvantage are you have to have a good packaging design, so you have to make sure your boxes are vented enough for the air to move through, depending on what those boxes look like. There's also some slightly higher costs and energy uses associated with this one. It feels like there shouldn't be, but if you do a direct comparison, the forced air cooling is usually a little bit more expensive on the energy side than the cooling rooms. Hydrocooling, so this is when produce is cooled by running cold water over it or immersing it in chilled water. Advantages, this is the fastest way to get heat off of crops really fast. So it also helps wash and hydrate produce. So you're kind of replacing some of that water that you lost. Also, it's a wash step. Disadvantage, it has to be potable water, so you have to have large volumes of clean water available. It's also not suited for all crops. A lot of crops can't handle being wet like this, so it's very crop specific. As you can see here, the structure here, this is at a co-op in Southwest Virginia that has a hydrocooler. So this isn't a small operation. But there's different ways of different size scales of doing this way. This is just a larger scaled one. And then old-fashioned ice. So crushed ice on top of the packed produce. Cools it down pretty fast. Liquid icing or slurry icing is a mix of water and crushed ice. It's pumped into boxes, fills the gap. Tube icing, tubes of ice are placed directly into the containers or alongside produce. So tube icing also would just be known as having an ice pack in there. So that's also really popular. There's some advantages and disadvantages. Advantage, provides rapid cooling and continues to absorb heat during transport. Disadvantage is it adds weight, requires waterproof packing, not suitable for all crops. The other thing with this one with ice is you can't control the temperature as well as you can with the other ones. Ice is ice, and as it melts, it's going to be less effective. So something to think about. And on that side, it can get too cold. So the USDA handbook also has this. All fruits and vegetables will freeze eventually and be of no value if they're cooled too far. If you think about pulling out a veggie pack from your fridge and you leave it to thaw, it turns to mush right? You have to saute or cook it right away. Same kind of thing. Temperate crops can usually withstand a lowest safe temperature between 0 to 5 degrees Celsius. Certain crops need about 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. Others can't tolerate any chilling, like think about a banana. And then when you're in doubt, check the handbook and they'll tell you pretty much exactly what range. Scientists throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, even today, even some of the research that we do in my lab are trying to figure out what those lowest safe temperatures actually are and then how different environmental factors affect them. So just because the handbook says this is going to work, if there was a heat wave beforehand or 2020, 2023, we had a heat wave in October and then it frosted like 2 weeks later, and our apple quality for those October apples was bad because of that freeze thaw that just happened when we tried to harvest them, for instance, as an example. So even if we had done everything right post harvest, the field still makes a difference. So this is why farming's such an investment, right? Well, that's all I have, but I'm happy to take any questions. And if you have any follow-up questions or are watching this recording, my email address is slacksuze@iastate.edu. And just a reminder, I am the fruit specialist. I know a little bit about veggies, but I'll be able to guide you to someone who knows way more about veggies than me if you have vegetable, like super vegetable specific questions. Thanks.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat. I know that we did receive one, and they are asking, does the lower end of the threshold for cool temperatures on produce ever change per crop?
It can change if they've been damaged in the field. So if you have a crop that's had chilling or heat injury, a lot of times you can't see it, like that apple example I gave. They might be a little bit more sensitive, but for the most part, it doesn't change. There has been some cultivar specific recommendations. So for instance, for apples, you can look in that book, it'll tell you, like, I think Jonathan's can handle a lower temperature than Honeycrisp, for instance. But for the most part, they're within a specific range per crop species.
If there are any more questions, we can give it a couple minutes and feel free to enter those on the chat. In the meantime, I'd like to thank Dr. Slack. Thank you for your time. It's been a great webinar. And for those watching this video as a recording, feel free to reach out to Suzanne anytime you need anything, or our department here at Farm Food and Enterprise Development.